The man who wrote the first letter died 19 years ago.
Julian Vance, worth $11 billion, sat in absolute silence, holding the evidence of the execution. It was dated January 1st, 2004. He remembered writing the words, but he no longer recognized the handwriting. The ritual was the cornerstone of Julian's life, more important than any quarterly earnings report. Every January 1st, at precisely 8 a.m., regardless of time zone, he wrote a single letter, a mandate to his future self, a performance review.
He sealed it, signed the front, and filed it in a temperature-controlled mahogany box housed in the private vault of Vance Capital.
Julian believed in optimization above all else. His life was a high-frequency trading algorithm. Every decision was measured against projected return on investment, even happiness. At 40, Julian was ruthless efficiency defined. He inhabited the highest strata of Manhattan, a penthouse overlooking Central Park that felt less like a home and more like an observation deck for the world he controlled. The air in the apartment was filtered, the light calibrated, the silence enforced. He did not own things, he owned results. In the first letter, 2004, the metrics were clear. The letter began not with a greeting, but with an audit. Julian, by the time you read this, the market cap of Vance Capital must exceed $5 billion. If not, you failed. Do not prioritize distraction. Remember the goal. He wrote about dominance because controlled was the only truly finite asset. He controlled the flow of information, the schedule of his days, the temper of his staff, and, most importantly, the narrative of his future self. The annual letter was the iron tether, ensuring his trajectory remained absolute. The early years, 2004 to 2008, were intoxicating. The letters tracked the upward curve of his net worth with cold, triumphant pride. In 2007, he wrote a single line about his wife, Clara. Clara is pleased with the Aspen acquisition. Clara was categorized as an asset requiring maintenance. The crack was not a sudden seismic event. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible widening in the narrative gap between his stated intentions and his actual priorities. The 2009 letter marked the transition. The financial crisis had stabilized Vance Capital's position against weaker firms, elevating Julian's status from millionaire to legend. But the tone of the letter shifted slightly. It was sharper, more paranoid. Do not trust the board. They fear your ambition. Family must be kept close, but separate from the... Julian remembered writing that line. He was protecting his family, he thought, by insulating them from the necessary brutality of his empire. But insulation quickly became... He began to notice, in retrospect, the increasing frequency of financial terms replacing human descriptors. His son, Daniel, was referred to in the 2011 letter as Daniel's educational fund is fully capitalized. Liability. That year, Daniel turned 16. Julian missed his school play, a small, inconsequential event involving a brightly painted wooden stage. Clara had left a note on the island countertop, handwritten, unusual for their high-tech home, asking him simply if he remembered the date. He hadn't. He had been negotiating a sovereign debt package in the UAE. The letter he wrote that January made no mention of the play, only the successful debt restructuring. The original mandate to be a good father, a secondary goal in the 2004 letter, had been quietly redacted by the accumulation of urgency. By 2014, the letters had become entirely functional. They were spreadsheets in prose. There was no mention of Clara, not even as a satisfied asset. The silence that replaced Clara's name was the most expensive silence in the billion-dollar apartment. He remembered the exact day the silence began to settle. It wasn't a fight. It was an absence of connection so total it felt physical. Clara moved to a brownstone downtown in late 2013, seeking what she called acoustic. The divorce, finalized in 2014, was clean, swift, and entirely financial. Julian ensured the settlement was generous, a testament to his fairness, he told himself. The letter written on January 1, 2015, read,
The 2014 financial restructuring, Clara-Daniel settlement, has zero material impact on long-term projections. Focus remains on APAC. That was his assessment of the dissolution of a 20-year marriage. Zero material impact. The man who wrote that sentence, Julian realized years later, was a machine, incapable of measuring the human cost.
He continued the ritual. The mahogany box grew heavier. The wealth grew exponentially. The number of people Julian could truly call by name, outside of a transactional context, shrank to zero. He reached the summit at age 60. The retirement ceremony was exactly what Julian Vance had designed: clinical, overwhelming, and public. Speeches were given by global leaders and celebrated by the financial media. He accepted the accolades with the quiet, practiced humility of a man who knew he deserved more. The day after the retirement event, January 2nd, the penthouse was abnormally quiet. Julian sat at the glass desk. The view was relentless, Manhattan stretching out like a conquered map. He finally retrieved the box. 20 years of commands, 20 years of self-audits. He placed the heavy stack before him. The anticipation was not nostalgic, it was purely professional. He was about to assess the legacy of the most effective man he had ever known. He began reading chronologically. The early letters, full of youthful arrogance and grand ambition, felt alien. They were written by a competitor he had beaten. The middle letters, from the age of peak control, were cold manifestos of financial aggression. The later letters were simply maintenance reports, a steady drip of sustained velocity. As he moved through the stack, the realization began to settle like silt. The letters told a story of increasing power, but they omitted the human context. They were the story of the firm, not the man. He reached the 2010 letter, which mentioned his son's college application process with a simple notation: Daniel accepted to target school, cost accounted.
Julian paused. He remembered the day Daniel left for college. He had been on a private jet, reviewing acquisition documents. He had sent a concise text message: proud, funds. He never saw his son off. He flipped forward to 2017. Daniel married that year. The letter mentioned nothing of the wedding. Julian hadn't been invited. He had received a formal announcement card, addressed generically.
He had delegated the gift selection to his personal assistant, a high-value, rare lithograph, a transactional acknowledgement. The absence of words began to speak louder than the pages filled with financial strategy. The letters meticulously tracked the growth of his investment portfolio, which was now 12 times larger than the initial goal of 2004. But they tracked the decay of his personal portfolio to absolute zero. Julian picked up the letter from 2019. It detailed the acquisition of a European distressed asset fund. It dedicated 3 paragraphs to the leverage structure. It contained no reference to the fact that Clara had passed away from a brief, aggressive illness that autumn. He hadn't been there. He read the obituary in the paper, sent flowers, and instructed his lawyer to handle the estate details regarding Daniel. He had compartmentalized the grief as an administrative task. Reading the letter now, Julian felt a sudden, profound disorientation. The man who wrote this, the 60-year-old self he was meant to be, was supposed to be dominant and fulfilled. Instead, he was terminal, financially successful, and spiritually bankrupt.
He had optimized for the wrong variables. He had won the wrong game.
The 2004 self had asked him to remember the goal. But the goal, Julian realized, was never just the money. The money was supposed to be the mechanism for control. He had mistaken the tool for the objective. He had sacrificed the very reason he started, the imagined future where wealth provided the security to truly live, for the pursuit itself.
The internal collapse was quiet, cold, and devastatingly logical. It wasn't the scream of a repentant sinner. It was the clinical diagnosis of a failed system. He had created a perfect machine, and that machine had consumed its creator.
Julian looked down at the 20 letters. They were not a diary of a life. They were an evidence ledger proving the systematic destruction of human connection over 2 decades.
The man he was in 2004 had trusted the man in 2024 to honor the contract.
The 2024 man was a fiduciary failure.
The realization brought a strange, surgical clarity. The billions were not a badge of honor. They were the physical manifestation of his failure. The wealth was the trap. To begin again, the trap had to be dismantled.
The transformation was immediate and controlled, echoing the efficiency of his past life, but applied to an entirely new objective, divestiture. He called his chief counsel, Elizabeth Thorne, the next morning, not for 8 a.m., but 7:55 a.m. He liked the psychological advantage of the missing 5 minutes.
Elizabeth, Julian's voice was calm, steady. We are going to dissolve Vance Capital's primary holdings and transfer 99% of my personal net.
Elizabeth, a woman accustomed to financial seismic shifts, paused. Julian, are you talking about a massive philanthropic endeavor? Which foundation are we?
We are creating a single, independent, heavily governed endowment, Julian stated. The Vance Legacy Fund. Its charter will be strict. Fund grassroots educational initiatives in underprivileged areas. No naming rights, no public association with me.
Anonymous.
99%, Julian? That leaves you $100 million. I need that to cover administrative wind-down for the next 6 months. After that, 0. I am not keeping the principal. I am liquidating. Thorne hesitated. Julian, this is not a decision to make lightly. Tax implications alone will require months of planning, and your personal...
I require a single wire transfer to an unknown account in Zurich. The sum should be precisely $4 million. A personal operating budget. Everything else goes into the fund. We start the paperwork immediately.
I need the documents ready for signature by the close of the...
Thorne knew Julian. When he used this voice, the decision was not up for debate. It was a directive for execution. The process took 6 months. Julian moved with the same relentless focus he applied to hostile takeovers. He watched the billions shift, the assets liquidate, the firm he built disintegrate into philanthropic bureaucracy. There was no pain, only the quiet satisfaction of correcting an error. The final administrative act was the quiet sale of the penthouse. He left everything, the tailored suits, the expensive art, the temperature-controlled mahogany box.
He bought a single utilitarian suitcase, paid cash for a commercial flight ticket, and flew across the country to a city he had never visited, Portland, Oregon.
Julian was 60 years old and held $4 million, an absurd sum for a fresh start, but statistically insignificant compared to the capital he had just walked away from. He rented a small, nondescript apartment near a large park. The noise of the street was unfiltered. The light was simply daylight. His first week was dedicated to mastering the art of the anonymous purchase: coffee from a small shop, groceries, a newspaper. He sat on park benches, watching people interact. He was applying his deep observational skills, once used to predict market movements, to predict human behavior. A wife waiting for a bus, a father catching a baseball. He realized the immense complexity of these simple, unquantified interactions. They had no ROI, yet they held all the value. He wrote a new letter on January 1st, 2025. He did not address it to his future self. He addressed it to no one. It was just a simple observation about the weather, the smell of rain, and the specific sound of children laughing without the interference of a corporate schedule. It was short, 2 sentences. He placed the letter in a plain manila envelope and tucked it into a drawer, not as a command, but as a record of presence. Julian Vance, the former Titan, was gone. The man sitting on the bench was simply Julian. He was no longer optimizing for control. He was optimizing for observation. He was applying the discipline of the billionaire to the fragile, ephemeral task of living, unburdened by the weight of a legacy he had rejected. He looked up at the vast, indifferent sky. He was 60, starting over, financially poor by his former standards, but temporally rich beyond measure. He had lost 20 years,
but he had bought back the future.
He still wrote, but now he wrote what he saw, not what he commanded.
There is another chapter to Julian's story, the unexpected challenge of building a real relationship after burning the earth around you for 20 years.
A story about the only person who truly understood the cost of his silence and the single phone call that broke the anonymity. We will explore what happens when Julian Vance tries to contact the one person he truly failed, and the surprising way he attempts to rebuild a foundation, not of steel and concrete, but of vulnerability. That story is coming next. Be here for the continuation of Julian's awakening.